Mr. Chairman and the members of the Assembly, I also serve on the Transportation Committee, and I think most of you, if you had heard the testimony, would not believe that a 10,000-foot train would be well served by having just one person on board, especially in the case of an accident or of mechanical problems. So if you vote against this bill, I think you're going to have to come up with some other excuse. I contacted the Public Service Commission to ask them concerning the ramifications if we adopted this bill. And I'd like to read that correspondence, or that email. So getting back to you on the issue of two-person crews, I did talk to the Federal Rail Administration, the FRA, and they said they don't support reducing crews to one engineer. The biggest safety risk of a one-man cruise is the inability to brake a train, resulting in blocked crossings or, in the case of an accident such as occurred in Larimore, the train would not have been able to be separated to allow for emergency vehicles to arrive at the scene through the crossing. Two-person crews also provide better distribution of duties, more accountability, and interaction to remain attentive on long trips, and more hands on deck in the event of an emergency. So I expect the FRA will be coming out with a rule this year requiring two-person crews on all hazmat trains. The railroads argue that new technology with automatic operating system facilities, operating system facilitates one-man crews. However, that technology won't be available on all the rail in the system, leaving crews where it isn't available short-staffed. Regarding the state's authority to pass a law requiring two-person crews, the answer is yes. We do have this right, and several other states have already passed such requirements. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative D. Anderson.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. May I ask the bill carrier a question, please?
Representative Becker, will you yield to a question?
Yes, I will, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Anderson.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Representative Becker, was there any discussion how this technology works on branch lines versus main lines?
Representative Becker.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Anderson, are you referring to the remote, the PTC technology?
Yes, the main lines are in much better condition, Representative Becker, than the branch lines, and I was just curious if it was going to be used on both lines.
Representative Becker.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Anderson, I don't know definitively if it's both. My understanding is that the technology is with the engine and so can be used on any line to remotely, if they missed pulling the horn, if they needed to change their speed, that's able to be done remotely. So unless someone else can answer, I assume that it's going to be on any lines in which the engines that have the technology are running.
Thanks, Representative Becker. Mr. Speaker, may I continue?
You may.
I have concerns, I guess, on branch lines. A lot of these branch lines are in not very good condition, and a lot of times I'll see two people on the train. One is looking out at the track and the other one is running the train. So I know there are some safety concerns on branch lines that would occur not on main lines. Thanks.
Representative Sibernagel.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Assembly, I won't dwell on a lot of the pieces that have already been discussed. I'd just like to say that I'm hopeful that the regs that do come forward do so rather quickly. I don't think we want to add a whole bunch of extra costs to the running of our rails, but in the meanwhile, I think it's a safety issue. And I think the Castleton example was a good case of that. And frankly, that train needed to be decoupled. And if it hadn't been decoupled, the situation, as bad as it was, could have been a lot worse. And so until we have the regs, and I hope we get them quickly, I hope it doesn't take as long as it does to approve the Keystone Pipeline, that we can get rid of this bill and move forward. So I'd ask for some green votes. Thank you.
Representative Casper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. A couple of comments about Castleton. As I recall that derailment, the heat from the fire was so intense and severe that no one could get near the site of the derailment for many, many hours. So the argument that two-man crew would have been able to decouple that train at that point in time, I don't think really is valid. Most of you know that I'm pretty much a states' rights person. However, when we're dealing with railroads, we're dealing with interstate commerce. And the Constitution provides the federal government to have regulation of interstate commerce, and that the railroads are under the Department of Transportation and the Federal Railroad Administration. So as we heard in testimony, there's regulation coming down. I don't know how big of an issue it is on the safety side of things with the fact that we've heard some of the testimony. So I would hope that we would give this a red vote. Thank you.
Representative Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. I just wanted to address some of the points that some of us who voted do not pass on this bill in the Transportation Committee had made, and just to share with you a little bit more information so that you can make a fully informed decision when thinking about how you're going to vote on this issue. Now, first of all, it's not like if we don't pass this bill that suddenly trains are going to be operated all over the state with only a single person crew. That's nowhere near the case. That's not going to happen. Currently, labor agreements between the unions and the railroads do not allow for single-man crews in North Dakota, although there have been negotiations around this particular topic. And even if they did come to an agreement, it's not like the railroads are going to use single-man crew in every instance. They're going to make that decision based on when it would be appropriate and when it would be safe to do that. I would say also that from the testimony that we received, there are only 3 states that we were told of that have legislation like this, specifically Washington, Wisconsin, and Arizona. And I would also like to add that single-person crew operations currently do exist in North America. And although it hasn't been until recently that this type of crew usage has even been thought of because of technological issues, labor agreements, etc. One good example of a railroad that uses single-man crews quite frequently is Amtrak. On their long-distance trains that have a planned duration of less than 6 hours, they use single-person engine crews regularly. This bill would not affect Amtrak, but that's a good example of a case where the railroad does use a single-person crew. There are a number of small freight rail operations in North America that have utilized or are utilizing single-person crews, so this is happening in North America, it's happening in Canada, it's happening in the United States, and it does happen throughout Europe. So there are times when a single person in the crew is appropriate. When are those times? I don't know. When should we have 2 members in the crew? I don't know. Surely there are many times. But are we qualified as a body, and this was my problem in the committee, am I qualified to make the decision for the railroads that they must always have 2 crew members in that train? I don't have the expertise to judge every particular situation, and I don't think that many of us here do as well. And so since we do know that it's in use throughout the world, that there are times when it is acceptable to use, if we pass this law, I'm worried about the unintended consequences that may come with it. If we are out of alignment with other rail that comes into or out of this state, this is an example where harmonized federal rules are a good thing. We do talk a lot about states' rights here, and we have the right to do many silly things that we want to, or not so silly things. But when it comes to rules of interstate commerce, that is an area where the federal government does have a responsibility to come up with harmonized rules for interstate operations to make sure that business can conduct itself freely through state borders. And so for that reason, and for the fact that I don't think we have enough information to know that you could never allow a single man on a train, I would urge you to uphold the committee's recommendation and vote red.
Representative Rick Becker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to address the first couple of representatives that spoke after I did. Dealing with this, what seems to be inherently logical aspect of a two-man crew being safer. And it does sound like it must be. On the other hand, we have very, very well conducted studies that shows it's not safer. It is absolutely not safer, especially with PTC, the new technology that's out. How do we know? Well, they can compare the two-man crews that are running and their incidents of accidents and various other scenarios to one-man crew. Where are the one-man crews? Amtrak, another representative gave an example. That's a one-man crew. And overseas, in Canada, there are one-man crews. There is a lot of statistical evidence that shows a two-man crew is not safer in the sense of having fewer accidents. Absolutely not true. I don't know that that's really debatable unless there are studies I haven't seen. What is debatable is if an accident occurs, do we derive some benefit out of a two-man crew? Again, two-man crew, one guy can jump out, break the train. There's a lot of emotion in some of these situations. We have Castleton and Larimore. Yet, no evidence is available at all that anyone benefited from the second crew member being able to break the train. The train was broken in Larimore. It could have been backed up in a less amount of time. In Castleton, the train was broken. Well, if I remember testimony correctly, it happened quite late. It happened at quite a distance because of the inferno that was occurring, and it was broken by a crew member who happened to be a trained firefighter and had the gear. Well, I don't think that that's going to be a situation that we run across very often. So again, if we take the emotion out of it, number one, it's not safer at all in preventing accidents, and it's very, very tenuous, any evidence whatsoever that a second member being able to break a train has, in any of these instances that have been cited, has actually helped. That's all. Thank you.
Representative Trottier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and members of the Assembly, it's been a tremendous discussion back and forth here. When I signed on to the bill, I did not know who the person was that asked me to sponsor it. And I hesitate to say this, but this is not, to me, is not a union versus management, union versus corporate. I believe it is, in my mind, and maybe my mind only, it is a common sense safety issue. We've heard all of the discussions and they've been very good, and you can go back and forth on these, but I still believe that just for safety's sake, I've heard that we do not and should not mandate anymore and put any more regulations on. People that don't like wearing seat belts will argue with you. People that like to smoke in a bar or a restaurant or in public places would disagree with us. Liability insurance doesn't make it any safer, but it makes us feel better. And I believe this is one of those kinds of laws that it recently in Ottawa with their big train wreck with oil cars, they had one man on crew. Immediately Canada put in two-man crews, a law for two-man crews. Again, just on my part, I think it's common sense and safety. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Silvernagle.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Assembly, I just want to make sure that we have accuracy in reflecting on the Castleton accident. Believe me, there was a sense of urgency from the moment the train accident occurred to decouple rail cars. Now, whether it happened in 10 minutes or an hour, I can't exactly tell you, but I can tell you there was urgency because it was hot. and these cars were exploding. And they needed to decouple, and they eventually did, 10 or 12 cars, so they could move the rest down the line. And I believe that there were actually some first responders that helped in that process. So again, I would encourage us to have some yes votes on this bill for safety.
Representative Ruby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members of the Assembly. As you can see from this discussion, we had a good discussion in our committee as well. And I think in the end, probably every member in there could have argued either side of this case or this bill. Yes, it does seem to make some common sense. But then again, you look at, is putting this in law going to be the right thing to do in every instance? Now, what brought this to us, it wasn't that the Burlington Northern was pushing to do this. They did mention it in a contract negotiation with their unions. That is a possibility. Well, some of the unions got kind of concerned that they would offer a lucrative enough offer to get one of the unions to agree to cut down. Now, they know that they're under the FRA as well, and they know that there's rules. They don't know what's going to be written. We had a lot of discussion trying to determine if we could get some information from DC about knowing would they be writing the laws relating to hazardous or flammable material, or would it be all freight? And it just kept coming back that we don't know. They really don't know. They may come back with their rules and say it's two-man crews only, and that's what we're going to be, that's what they're going to have to live with. And what we do in this law won't matter one way or another. Now, if we put it in and it gets superseded, either that they do allow it in some areas and then we'd have to change our law, or they do exactly what our law does and it's just wasted words in our century code, we can decide that. This argument is not new. I mean, back when there used to be a person that was in the caboose in the back of the trains years ago, then when they wanted to reduce them, there was the fight. There was several sessions ago, there was a fight between using the remote operators in their rail yards. And actually, that was a fight between two different unions. The railroads just kind of said, well, we have them and we have people that are qualified, but some of the personnel didn't like that. So we've had these arguments a lot, and I think that's why when this came to us, and initially you go, well, yeah, it should take two. They're very long trains. But we don't know in every instance if that's the right thing to do. That's mainly why we've ended up voting for the do not pass. We did hear that, yes, Amtrak has a one-person rail crew. They do have some extra personnel that are tending to the passengers, and in those situations, I suppose those people probably assist if they have to. Up in Canada, there's some areas where they've used one-man crews, and as we've heard, I'm sure with anything flammable, they're requiring the two, and maybe it's on all, I don't know. But, and that's Canada, that's not one Providence. So I think that's probably what they did. There's some in the United States. We had in our testimony that the Indiana Railroad, it's a short line, they run some one-man crews. Some of those may do that. I don't know that any do in North Dakota, and we didn't hear that any did. We didn't hear that they were going to do it. But because the discussion came up in that one contract, that's what brought this to us. And the union said, we gotta make sure that we keep two people on the train. And on one hand you can say, well, is that for job security or is it for safety? It could be both, and that's fine. But we just didn't think it was the right thing to do, is put this in law, be inflexible, and have that where there were no room for flexibility if the Federal Rail Administration decides to allow it in very similar or simple areas or with the technologies that may come out. And that technology that Representative Becker mentioned, the PTC, or it's the positive train control, that's a federal mandate on trains. So that will be on all railroad engines. But that doesn't mean that because that's on there, they're going to allow one-person crews on every car or every train that is running. So I would hope that this committee could, or this assembly could uphold the committee recommendation and give this a red vote and keep our law cleaned up, and more than likely whatever we do will get superseded. And yes, we have the frustration with the federal government mandating that. The fact of the matter is we don't have a choice, and we found that out when it came to other transportation issues with bumpers on grain trucks and things like that. We have very limited ability to regulate some of that stuff thanks to the federal government. So I would ask that we vote red on this and let this work its way out through this this next rule hearing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Casper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to respond to the previous remarks and clarify what I said earlier. I certainly understand that there is a need for urgency and a need to decouple in that Castleton train accident. That was not my point. My point was that having a two-person crew, because of the severity of the fire, would not have made any difference in the ability to decouple at that point in time. Obviously, you want to decouple as quickly as you can, but in that particular case, it would not have made any difference from my perspective. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just for a point of information for the body, I worked with USDOT for the past 20 years and been in rulemaking situations with Federal Highway for a number of occasions. Rulemaking has already begun for the Federal Railway Administration in this issue. It was also stated, and so I fully expect it to be completed before the end of the year. That being said, the other thing I wanted to let you know that was something was said earlier is 3 states currently have this law in effect. However, in Wisconsin, it was taken to court, and for the train sections that had the positive train control, the state law was preempted by the 7th Circuit Court to allow for one man with positive train control, in other words, remote control. So in that case, it was preempted based on the Federal Railway Administration. So there is a case where they allowed, even currently, one man with what they call remote control, the PTC. So I just wanted the body to understand that that did exist. Thank you.
Representative Carlson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Being a kid who grew up on the railroad line and lived in the depot, which most people don't remember what they are anymore, I can tell you that many times I was the second member on the crew when I sat up in the engine and got to blow the horn, and I don't think OSHA would quite allow that today. But let's just make sure what we're doing here is we pass state law. Already the union contracts state that there will be 2 people in the engine. These accidents, which are terrible things, had 2 people in the engine. They were already there by union contract. I really kind of struggle trying to figure out what happens if they hit the border of Minnesota with one engineer, stop the train at the border, have to load on a second one, and then when they get to Montana, they stop again and have to take one off because it only requires one in Montana. And I'm saying, how does this work? What good does this state law do if it's just us on interstate commerce? Now, I don't think there's any question that it's safer, but I have a friend whose son is an engineer, and they have really strict rules. You think the over-the-highway guys have a lot of rules for the time they can spend in the cab. When 12 hours hits, they stop that train, and they bring a van from wherever that closest other engineer in that hasn't been on duty, and he has to take his place because he's not going 1 more mile on that railroad track until when his hours are up. So there's a lot of laws and rules in place, and technology is important to all of us. And technology, this would supersede technology. Whether it's good or bad, it would supersede it by saying, no matter if you've got this other system on there or not, you're going to have 2 people sitting there. And as you heard from the prior representative, they struck that down. So, and I also have one other little problem when, if safety is so important, whether you're hauling soybeans or oil, I think it'd be really important to also have it when you're hauling people. And this doesn't deal with people on the passenger trains. So I think it's well intended, but I think it creates consequences on interstate commerce. I think it creates issues of whether or not you should require it on a passenger train or not. I think it doesn't answer questions what happens on the branch lines, which deal with a lot part of the states of North Dakota. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to support this bill because I think there's plenty of negotiations and union contracts in place that will handle this.
Is there further discussion? Seeing none, the House has before it for final consideration House Bill 1357. The clerk will open the key and you may record your vote. Has every member voted? Do any members wish to change their vote? The key will be closed and the clerk will take the record. The final vote shows 46 yea, 45 nay, 3 absent not voting. House Bill 1357 is declared failed.